So, ladies and gentlemen, our next topic, as I just mentioned, is the opening panel. And in your agenda, I think you would now expect Ms. Barbara Chrysler doing the moderation of the panel. Unfortunately, she had to cancel on very short notice because she had a medical emergency in her family, and just learned about it last night. So apologize for the confusion. So I'm going to be the moderator of the panel now instead of my fellow advisory board member, Ms. Barbara Chrysler. Unfortunately, again, because she is working for the United Nations, or a organization of the United Nations, and she would have had lots of things to say specifically about a couple of topics of relevance, but it is what it is, and we have to now go with what we have, and I'm trying to do my best to moderate the next 2 hours with our panelists. Now, the objective of this panel here is to provide a little bit broader context around the 6 or 7 agenda items we have defined and determined, so that the broader audience has some understanding what those subcommittees are talking about and what those issues are. And again, we have here very distinguished speakers who are all subject matter experts in the area of those 6 or 7 topics we are talking about. And the objective really is to provide an overview, a framework, and see how those topics are related and interconnected with each other. So that's the objective of what we would like to accomplish. And those 6 or 7 topics, by the way, are also key topics identified by the G20 in the context of the G20 meeting in Turkey later this year. They are identified by the United Nations in conjunction with their annual meeting in September, and they are also identified at various other organizations, including the World Economic Forum. So we have some kind of connection to a lot of other organizations, institutions dealing with those topics. And let me now start briefly introducing our panel members. And again, I'm very lucky and proud to have assembled such a impressive group around myself. And what we want to do is now, after I'm introducing our 6 panelists, they are each going to do prepared remarks of less than 10 minutes, each of them. And then in the second part of the panel session, we would like to, again, open it up for questions from the audience. So whatever you are interested in, maybe make a note while you are speaking. And then in the second part, we would like to make the session as interactive as possible, because we would like to bring everybody into the conversation. And even if you are not participating in that specific committee about which one of those people here is speaking, you might be interested to ask a question or get a little bit broader context. And again, we identified a lot of cross-cutting issues, so which are really connected to each other. And we also would like to try a little bit understanding those better. Now let me start introducing the first panelist for the Food Committee. If you maybe briefly could stand up, Dr. Patrick Kohler. Stand up, please. Patrick is the head of the Agri-Food Chain Unit at the European Commission's Directorate General for Research and Innovation in Brussels. So thanks for joining us. The second panelist I would like to introduce is for the Global Financial Industry Banking, Mr. Dr. Dirk Lubik. Please briefly stand up. Dirk is a managing partner at Deutsche Bank, responsible for advising the bank's executive management on developing and executing the bank's group strategy. And we are very happy and pleased having Dirk now today with us, sharing his wisdom. He had been a co-chair last year at the 2014 summit, and he has lots of information to share, and looking forward to the discussion, Dirk. The third panel member I would like to introduce for the Global Demographics Development Committee is Mr. Mark Purdy, coming from Ireland to us. He is a senior executive and chief economist with Accenture's Institute for High Performance. And I'm very curious what you have to say about global demographics. That's really an extremely interesting topic, and let's see how this is going to shake out during the summit and overall. Next panelist representing or speaking about the Creating Jobs Committee is Ms. Linda Kramjung from Switzerland, actually, located in Switzerland currently, originally from the Netherlands, I think, right? And she is the Secretary General of the International Organization of Employers, which is the largest network of the private sector globally. So very impressive function, and we are very glad having you here as a panelist as well. Then the next panelist on a very new topic, so we never talked about that before, for a variety of reasons, which is the Digital Innovation and Transformation Committee. So we are very pleased to have Jonas Schnellstrand with us. He's a senior executive advisor with the SAS Institute and the SAS Institute in the United States. And it's kind of a think tank or powerhouse if we talk about big data, and looking forward to all of those discussions as well. And the last panel member regarding the Energy Committee is Dr. Christoph Frey, originally from Switzerland, I think, but currently located in the UK. And he is the Secretary General of the World Energy Council, and he has lots of interesting things to share with us about energy, the economics around it, politics, and so on and so forth. So it looks like we have really assembled an outstanding group of people providing a little bit more broader context around all the subjects which are being discussed over the next 3 days, and for which we hopefully have a very powerful output in form of a final document. Now, the first prepared remarks, I would like to invite now Dr. Patrick Kohler to the microphone. And let me just make a brief introduction. So the world population has more than doubled since 1960, exceeding 7 billion in 2013. And by the way, I think in 1900, so 100 years ago, it was just, I think, 1 billion. And demand for food will rise further in the coming decades. So there's no question about that, because another 2 billion people are going to be added until 2050. And the World Bank has projected that worldwide demand for food will increase by 50% by 2030. However, there are still almost 1 billion people, almost 20% of the entire global population, which is going every day hungry to bed. So, Patrick, I'm very interested about understanding from your position as a representative or working with the European Commission or an organization of it, how the European Commission would tackle all of those challenges, and what you could share on that subject matter.
Thank you, Holger, for this nice introduction. Let me also thank in the beginning to the organizers for inviting me for the first time to this exciting summit, from which I hope I will also learn many new things myself, and also meet people and colleagues, I guess also future colleagues, whom I usually don't meet on the meetings that I am attending in my capacity as the head of unit of the agri-food chain. It is a challenge to speak also after Mr. Ribot with his very exciting and visionary speech. He, as one of the top persons at Danone, in his speech also mentioned several times food security, challenges for food industry, and what implications they have for our daily life. As you will see, I think, through my presentation, but also after, I think at the end, when you will hear conclusions from different committees, food security is something that has a lot of links with what will be discussed in other panels in other areas. It's linked to demographics, demographic change. It's linked also to the energy which you need to produce food. You also use, for example, food waste to produce energy again. Let me start by some brief introduction to the food security. There is a definition which says, it's a United Nations accepted definition saying that food security exists when all people at all times have access to sufficient, safe and nutritious food to meet their dietary needs and food preferences for active and healthy lives. Sounds nice, but not easy to achieve. There are many global challenges for food and nutrition security, in particular to the population growth, that has been just mentioned by Holger, increasing urbanization, more and more people live and want to live in cities. There is also limited availability of basic natural resources, and we should not forget about the increasing effect of the climate change on food production. Let me give you some figures that underpin these main challenges. I think you see them on this slide. This is the only slide that I'm showing today. In order to feed a projected population of 9 billion on the planet by 2050, we will need to increase the food production by nearly 70% by this time. Now, the human population consumes the resources already of 1.5 planets. If we follow the business as usual, the way how we are working on producing food today, we will need 2 Earths by 2030 to feed the population of 1. Each year, 1.3 billion tons of food are lost or wasted, and that represents 1/3 of all food produced for human consumption. Going back to the agriculture production, arable land provides 30% for 95% of our food, and nearly 40% of it is degraded by some degree and will be further affected by the climate change. Globally, 3.5 billion people, so half of the people of our planet now, are malnourished, while nearly 2 billion people, adults, are overweight. So these are the challenges that we are facing now, and coming, let's say, to different initiatives and from the challenges to the potential solutions. Let me first say that 2015 is a very important year for food security, for different kind of policy initiatives that are taking place. For example, in Milan, not that far from here, the World Exhibition, World Expo 2015, is taking place for 6 months under the title Feeding the Planet, Energy for Life. Milan Expo is not just the place where you come to visit pavilions of different countries where they show, let's say, their food production, their national dishes and so on, but it's also a very interesting platform for dedicated conferences, allows for stakeholder interactions and consultations and expert reflections which are being assessed and gathered, for example, in different policy documents. Let me mention only one, which is prepared by the EU Expo Scientific Steering Committee, chaired by the former Commissioner for Agriculture, Franz Fischler. Another initiative to be mentioned is a Global Alliance for Climate Smart Agriculture, and that was launched last year at the UN Climate Summit in New York and has already been joined by more than 20 countries. This alliance focuses on food and nutrition security from global perspective and tries to bring governments, farmers, scientists, businesses, and civil society together to adjust their agriculture practices, food systems, and social policies so that they take into account the climate change and efficient use of natural resources. Last but not least, 2015 is also the year where, on the United Nations level, there is a reflection on the reach of Millennium Development Goals that were set back in 2000 and now are being revised into Sustainable Development Goals, the so-called SDGs. Out of these 17 SDGs that will be adopted in September, there are several that are directly relevant for food and nutrition security and are expected to call for further concrete actions to meet these post-2015 targets. And these are: 1, end hunger, achieve food security and improve nutrition and promote sustainable agriculture. Next, ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. And third, ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. Last, fourth, conserve and sustainably use the oceans, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development. Coming now to the area where I'm actively working at the European Commission, Directorate General for Research and Innovation. This Directorate General mainly focuses on bringing research to reality through innovation, through funding research and innovation, through the European framework programs for research that have just celebrated that 30 years this year. You might have already heard that the current framework program that we are funding, that has started in 2014 for next 7 years, is called the Horizon 2020. And it supports research and innovation on food and nutrition security through the societal challenge that we call, that has a very long name, food security, sustainable agriculture and forestry, marine and maritime and inland water research, and the bioeconomy. Only this title alone tells you about the very big scope and the complexity of the area that we are funding. Coming to some of the figures, in the first 2 years, 2014 and 2015, we have funded more than 240 million euros into the food and nutrition security research and innovation. We are planning to spend another 430 million in calls that are planned for 2016 and 17. Of course, it's not only research and innovation that can contribute to solving food and nutrition security challenges. We should also be looking, for example, and I think Mr. Ribot has given some references to that, food safety as a key element of global trade. For example, the developing countries do not usually meet the very high food security standards of the European Union, and for that reasons, they have difficulties to export their food products. Second, we also need a modern, science-based and consumer-aware regulatory framework that needs to be developed nationally, but also supranationally, for example, on the EU level. There is also a need to demonstrate that systemic changes are possible and necessary for a more sustainable food and nutrition system that is capable of producing more with less and contributing to improved people's health and well-being. So, in short, I try to give you, let's say, an overview where we are heading, where the action is needed. And I believe, and I'm convinced, and I'm looking forward how the forum, and especially the Committee on Food Security, will demonstrate that these systemic changes are possible. Thank you.
So, Patrick, thanks very much for providing that context around Food Committee. And I think, at least those people who did not spend yet time on that subject got a little bit of perspective what we are trying to accomplish in the context of this event here. Now, our next speaker is going to be Dr. Dirk Lubig. As I said, Managing Director at Deutsche Bank. And this is a very interesting topic. Maybe I'm a little bit attached to it as well, because I'm living in the United States, also working in the financial services industry, and certainly a stable financial system is very important for a global architecture that's supposed to functioning. And there was a lot of regulatory activity, rulemaking, and so on and so forth. So, for example, in the United States, there's something called Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which imposed 10,000 of requirements. If you go to quantitative literature in terms of what is new required, for example, in the context of capital requirement, liquidity requirement, and I'm very interested now getting Dirk's intelligence around what he thinks about all of that and how he could a little bit provide recommendations from what he has been doing last year in his capacity as co-chairman, and how he could carry over the thinking from last year into what the group is going to do this year. So, Dirk, please come on stage. And
thanks, Holger, for the nice introduction. As you mentioned, I would like to give the group here some food for thought on what's going on in the financial service regulatory and the G20 implementation. And I don't have any slides. I just have a couple of bold comments. And therefore, I have to caveat one thing, or what I say here, and that was very important for my employer, Deutsche Bank, is my personal opinion, not the official opinion of Deutsche Bank, which is also very important for myself, because that brings me the luxury, basically to make a couple of very provocative and bold statements. And that's ultimately also potentially for you important, because it's much more fun the next couple of minutes to hear rather bolder statements than just, politically correct statements. So let me start with my first statement, and that is I'm really 100% convinced that regulation was and is critically important to create robust and resilient financial institutions and a robust financial system. As we all know, the global financial crisis in 2007 and 2008 was one of the most severe liquidity crises that we had since the Great Depression, not only in Europe, but also in the rest of the world, leading to the global recession and also to the European sovereign debt crisis, which is, as we all know, more actual than ever with all the discussion in Greece. So it was a fortune that the G20 decided in November 2008 to come together in Washington and to commit to fundamentally reform the financial system. And the clear objectives were to correct the fault lines that led to the crisis. And if you think about it, the aspired reforms are an essential prerequisite to the G20's overall objective, which is to enable strong, sustainable economic growth. So my second statement is that the G20 played a key role and made significant achievements over the last couple of years by developing, implementing a new regulatory framework that hopefully hinders future financial crises. And we all know the implementation of key principles, Basel III, the Recovery Resolution Plan. We have higher capital ratios in the industry, which are very important. We are working on leverage ratios and also on liquidity ratios. So these are all measures that are going in the right direction. However, despite the great achievements, the volume of financial regulation is consistently increasing. It's getting more national and regional focused. It's getting more prescriptive. It's getting even sometimes conflicting. So the complexity is adding back a lot of additional costs and inefficiencies to banks and financial service providers who are operating in global markets. And as you can hear between these lines, and that is my next statement, I'm really concerned that an overly regulated framework has significant downside potential. It creates regulatory arbitrage opportunities and national protectionist trends that hinder global growth. So proactively, you could even say that we are at a stage where regulation has started to jeopardize actually the way or what they actually wanted and intended to do to foster global economic growth. I see in particular consequences in three areas: for the end customer, for taxpayers, and for the society. Let me elaborate a little bit on what I mean with that. Negative consequences for the end customers, I do see in particular three challenges. The increasing regulatory requirements have significant cost implications for banks. Alone in Germany, we basically expect to have an annual additional cost for regulatory requirements, which is around 2 billion euro. And the increased compliance costs are partly borne by or transferred to the end customer. So that's the first big challenge. The second is that basically the market fragmentation results in reduced liquidity and higher transaction costs for the end customers. And at worst, this has not only implication for the end customer, but it also increases the volatility in the market and results in financial instability. The third negative consequence for the end customer is, and because of the fact that regulated banks are retrenching more and more from activities they are used to do, such as interest rate hedging or subprime lending, for example, causing end customers more and more to basically look for alternative solutions in the shadow banking industry, which is unregulated, where the price is sometimes suboptimal, where you have higher counterparty risk, and sometimes you even don't find possibilities to transfer risk. I do see the negative consequence for the taxpayers in particular, because as I just mentioned, that certain products and services that have been traditionally offered by banks are now basically moved into the shadow banking market, into a largely unregulated market. So I think that the systematic risk has not comprehensively addressed so far in the whole framework. And also we see certain reactions already from certain banks because they need to use their resources much more efficient. And the reduction is that they either retrench from certain products or they start to securitize, for example, non-risky, low-yielding mortgage portfolios into the market, or they basically start to invest in assets where you see higher yielding returns. So they invest in higher riskier assets, which is also ultimately potentially a systemic risk increase. And then lastly, I see potential negative consequences for the financial service industry and for the society as regulation is becoming more and more not only a backstop against risk, but also determining how banks are structured in the industry and also deciding and determining how business models are compiled. This is something which causes inefficiencies for the financial service in the financial service industry, and ultimately it's also then an impact for the society. Having outlined these negative consequences, and this is my fourth statement, I do believe the overall objective of all regulatory activities should be to serve the needs of the end customers, to protect the taxpayer, and ultimately also to foster economic growth for the benefit of the society. I therefore urge this group, in particular the G20, to reassess if the current approach really is complying with these overarching objectives. And the key focus for the regulators and supervisors should now be to shift from adding more regulatory requirements and rules to ensure that reforms are implemented everywhere in a consistent and cohesive way. And don't misinterpret my message. I'm saying we have achieved major milestones. It's a big success that the cornerstones of the G20 agenda are in place. But now I think it's time, and that's my last statement here, for us as young business leaders, as Frank was saying, to really step back, reflect, and ask us the question if all the regulation producing actually what we intended to do. And therefore, I really encourage this group here, in particular, the participants of the Banking Committee, to reflect on a couple of questions. So how do we ensure that regulation is today and in the future not going too far? How do we ensure that regulation is not getting overly complex, in some cases even conflicting? And how do we ensure that regulation does not favor national or regional interest versus global interest? So let me pause here and thank you for your attention.
So, Dirk, thank you very much. It was really a very interesting and excellent summary around global financial regulation and gives a lot of food for thought. And it's really, I think, the big advantage here for the committee working on it is really to take a fresh look, on a clean sheet of paper and really think about what Dirk just mentioned, which makes a lot of sense, in my opinion. And really, we have a platform here to take a little bit of deeper dive to think how that could look like. So that was really outstanding summary, I think, to create a little bit of sensitivity in the audience, what this is all about. Now, the next committee panel member or speaker is Mark Purdy on global demographic developments. And there are multiple, I call it demographical trends and predictions that are going to be heavily influence how we are going to live in the future. First of all, I mentioned earlier the world population is going to rise over 9 billion by 2050. Then also, secondly, there's an aging population, and growth is being projected primarily in the developing countries. And also we are seeing an increasing number or growth of an affluent middle class, and all that mixture together is going to be an interesting combination. And now I'm very curious to see what Mark's perspective are on all those different trends and what that would mean for each of us today or for the generations to come what are the tension points, and what are potential solutions dealing with those kind of issues.
Holger, thank you very much. Well, it's great to be here today and to try and set the scene a little bit on global demographic developments. There were three areas that I really wanted to focus on today. First, what do we mean by demographic developments? What are the dimensions of change? Secondly, what's the feedback loop from demographics to other areas? So energy, resources, food security, finance, and so on. And thirdly, and I think most importantly, I want to try and get us, during our discussions, to try and challenge perhaps some of the orthodoxies, some of the conventional wisdom around demographics, because I think it is an area where you get a lot of conventional wisdom, and sometimes the conventional wisdom with some creative thinking can be overturned. And really my key message is going to be that, we often hear that demographics is destiny. Well, demographics is not destiny. With creative thinking, with imaginative solutions, we can actually respond in some positive ways to demographic change. So if we just move to the next slide. Have we got to, okay. Need to go back one. Yes, okay. So this is what I call the demographics triangle. And it's got three sort of dimensions: population growth, aging, and the movement of people. The first trend is really around the scale of population growth. We've already heard a few statistics. The world currently has 7.3 billion people. And that's 1 billion more people than 12 years ago. So we've already seen a massive increase in the world's population. By 2030, the world will have another 1.2 billion people, so we'll be up to around 9 billion. So although the rate of population growth is actually slowing a little bit, we're still adding a tremendous number of new people to the earth. The other thing to notice and to note here is that growth is going to be geographically concentrated. More than half of that population growth between now and 2050 will be in Africa. We'll have 1.3 billion people. And just over a third will be in Asia. And we heard Frank talking earlier about the importance of Africa. That's the place where the growth will come from. That's the place where we'll have the new markets, the new consumers, the new workers, the new students, and so on. By contrast, Europe's population will actually shrink. So there's a kind of a geographical redistribution of population that's going on here. The second dimension is population aging. And I think the key thing to remember here is that, for most of its history, for all of the time that people have been on the earth, the world has actually been relatively young. And the reason for that was quite simple, that people didn't live very long. So you always had a young population. And now what we're seeing is that even in most parts of the world, and even in those parts of the world that currently have a young population, those populations are gradually aging, faster in some areas than in others. And the causes are quite simple. It's down to declining fertility rates, but it's also a function of rising life expectancy. We've now got the global life expectancy is now about 70 years. So if we look sort of forward to 2050, so at the moment we've got about 900 million people in the world aged 60 or over. By 2050, that figure will have almost doubled. So, just kind of think about that for a second. That's equivalent to an extra 500,000 people over 60 for every week of the next 35 years. So if you think about it that way, it's really a kind of an unprecedented shift that we're seeing in the age structure of the world's population. It's obviously going to have tremendous consequences in lots of areas around healthcare, finance, pensions, and so on. The other thing to note about aging, a common misconception is that it's just an issue for the Western world, for developed economies. It actually isn't. It's happening in both developed and developing countries. If you look at China, China has about 15% of its population aged over 60 today. By 2050, that will be 36%. And that's a much faster rate of aging than Germany or France or any of the Western economies have actually experienced. Even if you look at India, you know, we think of India as a country with a young population, and it does generally, but it's going to experience aging as well. So the proportion of people aged over 60 will move from 9% to 19% by 2050. So this is a very sort of prevalent trend. Third dimension is movement, which sometimes doesn't really get that much attention, but it's hugely important. I mean, volumes of international migration are very high. Some of that's driven by economic factors, so kind of pull factors. Some of it's driven by geopolitical factors, so, you know, kind of push. And we're seeing some of the consequences of that playing out in the Mediterranean at the moment. We are seeing a significant movement of people from low-income countries to high-income countries, about 4 million people annually. But I think it's also interesting to look at what's going on within countries. You know, we're seeing significant movements of people within regions, within countries, and particularly from rural areas to urban areas. So half of the world's population, actually 54%, now live in cities. And that's going to rise to 66% by 2050. And, you know, and actually most of that urbanization will be in Africa. So you can think about the consequences and the implications that has for all sorts of areas around resources, energy use, infrastructure provision, and so on. Let's move to the next slide. So what does all of this mean? Well, the sort of the kind of conventional view, which, you know, I call the demographics as kind of destiny argument, is that these demographic trends, once set in motion, are very hard to unwind. And also that generally they have a whole series of unfavorable consequences around, you know, resource depletion, food insecurity. You know, we've heard about the fact that we're going to need another sort of Earth, by 2050. You know, rising sort of healthcare costs as we have a much older population, pressure on public finances as more people retire. Also issues around declining productivity from an older population and less innovation. The idea that somehow an older population is less entrepreneurial or less inventive or less prone to risk taking. So one of my hopes over the next couple of days is that we can start to maybe challenge some of these orthodoxies in our discussions. You know, perhaps we can't change demographic trends. I mean, there's not much we can do about the fertility rates or rising life expectancy. We wouldn't even want to sort of change it. But we can change how we respond and how we anticipate these trends. And I'd like to remind us of this person. Probably most of you have read about him at some stage, particularly if you studied economics, Thomas Malthus. Back in the 18th century, he made a whole series of kind of dire predictions about population growth. So he said it would lead to food scarcity, slower growth. He said you shouldn't pay workers higher wages because if you did, they'd have larger families and that would drag wages back down again. So he was a very pessimistic person. It also turns out that Malthus was wrong on just about every prediction he ever made. And the reason why he was wrong is that he failed to factor in things like new technology, increasing agricultural productivity. He failed to factor in the fact that people tend to have smaller families as their incomes and living standards rise. So I think that today, in a similar fashion, we need to challenge orthodoxies. You know, we need to think about what the orthodoxies are. And just to say, is there a different way? Is there a more kind of creative solution that maybe could even turn this trend into an opportunity? And just to briefly give one orthodoxy that I think we could challenge, the idea that an aging population will result in low productivity and slower growth, which we hear quite a lot. And I think what we're seeing now is that with all sorts of new technology, adaptive technology, digital technology, lifelong learning, the changing nature of work, the move from kind of manual labor to knowledge-based services, the fact that people are not only living longer, but also healthier lives, that, for all of those reasons, we're seeing that actually productivity can be maintained across, pretty much across the whole life cycle. And of course, there are other orthodoxies that we could challenge, and maybe that's something we can come back to in the panel discussion later. So the key message I want to leave you with today is, yes, we are seeing dramatic change in the world's population, but let's not accept demographics as destiny. Let's set a challenge for ourselves to find new and creative ways to address these demographic issues. So thank you very much.
Yeah, Mark, thank you very much. Very interesting and impressive numbers and quotes right at the very last slide. So again, a lot of food for thought, I think, to get a perspective what this is all about. Now, the next committee panel member I would like to ask is Linda Kromjung. Again, Linda is the Secretary General of the International Organization of Employers. And likewise, as the world population is increasing, unemployment apparently is increasing too, specifically amongst young people and specifically in certain regions and areas. I was reading a statistic 2 days ago. I think there is a region in Germany where they have 35% unemployment, and I think 55% relates to people below 25, which is quite shocking. And I never really heard about that. I don't know how really important it is in the broader scheme of things, but in that region, it's kind of really a kind of a catastrophe, I think. Now, creating jobs, I cannot think about any person better to ask for than Linda in her current capacity as being the Secretary General of the International Organization of Employers, to let us know how jobs could be created, and we would avoid, in certain regions at least, those kind of statistics and developments.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Well, thank you all for inviting me here. And I think there's a lot of pressure being put on me about me being able to create jobs. I just want to manage expectations here. I will not be able to do so, but maybe all together we will. So I think, first of all, I would like to share a bit with you what is the International Organization of Employers all about, because I'm relatively new in this role, but I have experience over the last 3 to 4 months that not everyone says immediately about IOE, I know what that is about. So we are the global voice of business. We do represent 155 employers' federations across over 140 countries. But there is also an increasing need not only to understand, say, the Employers' Federation national view, but also understand your perspective coming from the business, where I also came recently from. So therefore, we have 3 different networks where we have over 40 multinationals, where a few of them are here as well in this room, that together with us collaborate on topics of interest to them. And one of them, for example, is being on industrial relations and business and human rights. And I want to say here, it's us, business, that is the driving force in making sure that we do create jobs. It's no one else that will be able to do so. Why is it relevant that we do create jobs? And I don't want to spend too much time on this one, but just want to highlight a few factors here. Without jobs, without creating growth, we all know we all have economical issues facing us. And I want to highlight here, and I will come back to that a bit later as well, that youth unemployment is a big issue here. But also, I think we have to acknowledge that if there's no jobs, there is going to be a huge impact on our social cohesion, but also on the social national resources that we all are contributing to. It's also relevant for a social sustainable society. If people are unemployed, we're not talking about inclusiveness, we're not talking about providing, say, a meaningful life, we're not guaranteeing an income, and that is something that we should not forget and is relevant to address here as well, not only for the younger people, but also for the older generation. And last, it's also crucial to make sure that we have a political stable environment we all operate in. We all know if there's no jobs, if there's no food, if there's insecurity, that does create an environment that I would not like to be in. And I feel very fortunate, living in countries where that stability currently is there. What are the trends, the challenges, but also the successes that we do see when we're talking about creating jobs? A few trends already have been highlighted. I just want to focus on a few of them. First one is modest economic growth, and I think that's still an issue. It's not only about modest economic growth, it's also that we see, based on figures, that the number of jobs being created is not really getting traction very much at a global level. And that is something that we see as a trend, and how do we counter the trend and make sure that we do provide jobs for everyone. The other one is about youth unemployment. It was already highlighted also in the demographics with the previous speaker. Youth unemployment is a big issue. We don't want to face, in 10, 20 years, a lost generation that never ever had the opportunity to find a job. Today, there's still over 70 million young people not having a job. And of course, there are differences depending on what part of the world you're in, but it's something that we as a business need to address. And as already said, it's part of many, many agendas, including the G-20Y. And also, I think climate change, and let's not underestimate the impact that is going to have also on jobs. And let's not only see climate change as a risk, but also as an opportunity, but for sure it will change the nature of some of the jobs. It will create opportunities, but it also will lead to opportunities being lost in specific areas. So we need to be creative as business, how to accommodate for that change. If we look into, say, challenges, and it's good that it's on the agenda of the committee, it's about skill matching, it's about skill shortages, it's about bringing them together within, say, from a supply and demand perspective. And it's also about how do we make sure that the geographical mismatch that we do have, which also leads into, I say, huge labor migration as a topic that is really gaining momentum. How do we combine those trends? How do we find solutions for that? And one of the things that we need to acknowledge is that in many countries, business still suffers from very rigid labor policies and regulations. It was already addressed from a financial sector perspective, but also from a labor and employment perspective. There is room for improvement there to make sure that we have a more flexible labor market in place that accommodates the need of the business, but also the need of the workers. People want different things now. Part-time working, time out, balancing our careers is something that is relevant to address. If we look into the successes, I think there's also some successes to share, and let's acknowledge those as well. Business is taking its responsibility to combat unemployment. It is being addressed at international level. It is being on the top of the agenda of many of the institutions. And the G20 recommendation on youth unemployment is getting its follow-up, and it's is being lived through. Sustainable development goals and follow-up of the Millennium Development Goals were likely to become adopted in the 70th session of the UN in September, where there is goal number 8 that I think is something that should be taken into account: promote sustained, inclusive and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment and decent work for all, which should be something that we all should work together to achieve that. We are finding more and more public-private partnerships where we really business, governments, other institutions find each other in trying to find solutions. And I want to highlight here one of them, which is the Global Apprenticeship Network, the GAN, which has been created as follow-up to one of the G20 recommendations in the past. And now we see that global apprenticeship networks are being set up Although it was only a relatively new initiative, in 2014 it was kicked off. National networks have been established already in Turkey, in Indonesia, in Spain, Mexico, Brazil, likely Argentina will follow. In 2016, there is a few African countries on the list, with the hope that those countries will serve as a hub, to expand and model the knowledge, the skills, the tools that have been developed towards other countries, and make sure that youth has a future, which is also a need for companies to address. Migration, already touched upon it. Migration currently, I would say, in the public debate is being seen as a risk. It's been seen as something that we should stop. We should close all our borders. Well, the question really is that the right approach? Knowing what we're knowing now, that we do need a diverse society, that we have labor shortages and skill shortages, but also coming from the perspective that enriching our view to the world with other people, embracing them, engaging with them, I think, it's an appeal to business to see it as an opportunity, as a risk, and influence the debate there. If we look into shaping the future, and what I think is expected from us here in this room, it's about making sure that we have business and labor markets that are flexible, that we've got the policies in place that support business in achieving its goals. It has to bring migration, but also temporary worker policies in line with the labor market needs. Education, training and skills already touched upon in various matters already this morning, but they need to be better respond to the demands and need of the labor market. And we should focus there also on flexible working arrangement where we can combine both learning and working. And we should also focus on recognizing skills, education acquired in a certain country and making sure if you move to another place that there is a value and it's recognized there as well. We have to look into inclusive policies that also include women and youth, because that's where there is a huge potential still to being addressed. And it also would, focus on making sure the inequalities that we still see across the globe should be addressed by having this more inclusive. I think most important for me here is that it's what's the business role in all of this. Business is, again, as already said, it's the creator of jobs. It's our responsibility to influence the debate, national level, international level, but also make sure that business takes leadership. Without leadership of business, it's not going to happen. Demand your seat at the table, as I already said this morning, influence your direct environment, but also convince your CEO that it's relevant to do the right thing, and make sure that there is a strong collaboration with business, with other associations and institutions. Do not hesitate to reach out to sometimes to parties that may have a different view, as that will only enrich debate. But when we find solutions together, that's the best way forward. I thank you.
Linda, thank you very much. So our next panelist is Jonas Schnellstrand, who is going to talk to us about digital innovation and transformation. And that subject really is impacting everybody. I think everybody is impacted. The question is to what extent this is going to impact you. And it is like the industrial revolution that took place 160 years ago when steam engines were combined with machineries. The same is happening currently based on two great innovations, being one, personal computer, and number two, the internet. And that combination, what comes along with cloud computing and all kinds of services, offerings in the digital world, connectivity, and so on and so forth. So I'm very, very interested now, Jonas, getting your perspective about what that means for all of us, and not just only for a couple of IT people, because it's really impacting, I believe, everybody in the room and future generations to come, and it's increasingly important. Thank you all very much.
Now, the subject I'm about to touch upon is actually kind of hard to grasp. So play with me for a little bit. If I can ask you to kindly just shut your eyes and imagine that you are back in 1910. Prosperity of that decade is about to hit, and everybody's wondering what's going on. The automotive or the automobile is just around the corner, literally. Electricity is getting introduced, and you're on your way to a venue like this to listen to somebody who's going to be telling you that for the next 50 years, electricity is going to bear a few things. One, it's going to cause you to lose about 2 hours on average sleep every night, so now you know why you're tired. It's also going to cause you to listen to somebody speaking out of a box from a distance, and a little bit later, that person is going to be visible in another box, still speaking out of the box. You're going to be able to have personal music. You are going to be able to call and talk to somebody in real time on another place on the planet. You're going to carry your little music with you. And foremost, you're going to walk into your house, flip a switch, and there will be light. Thank you. If I am that person, and it's 1910, you will be highly skeptical. But we all know in retrospective what has happened. Our opening speaker this morning said, everything is going to change. I don't know if everything's going to change, but a lot is going to change. And we are in the midst of this change. We are in an industry that is fairly young, about 15 years young. That is how long we have been playing with this technology. Now, there are a few things that we need to keep in mind. One is that the world we've created around the digital technology creates a lot of data. Useful, unuseful, big, small, relevant, not relevant, etc. This data is going to be needed to take care of one way or the other. The company I work for, SAS Institute, we produce the type of algorithms that can make sense out of the ones and zeros, hopefully. Connectivity is another feature of this technology. You see, it really is the way like it was with the fax machine. Are you familiar with fax machine? How many still use fax machines? I'm sorry, this is a really old example, but it really drives a true point home, and that is that the first fax machine ever produced is useless. It is brought into value by the second one produced, because that's the only way you're going to be able to send somebody a message through a fax machine. Our opening speaker said that, you shouldn't be in front of technology, you should always be second. I think that is what he meant. However, nothing happens unless the first one is produced. So connectivity becomes the driving factor of the digital age. And the faster we are building out this connectivity in cheap and affordable way, the better off we are as a society in a whole. You see, because if there is a creation where half of us have access to internet and the other half doesn't, you're going to get a stalemate situation on technology evolution. I don't think that's going to happen. It seems to be driving itself fairly well. The third key factor is the time issue. Near real time or real time. And let me give you an example. To get a 2-second lag of information coming to your car that will allow you to avoid a serious accident is not valuable. You need that information in the precise time to avoid the accident. I know this sounds far-fetched, but if you've ever ridden in one of the self-driving cars, you would know exactly what I'm talking about. And this is a very strange feeling when you realize that the car's steering input is lagging so little, but you still notice it. It really wreaks havoc on you as a person when the machine is driving you. So time factor becomes crucial. And if you look at most of the technology companies are actually focusing a lot on the time factor. If you take a car, for instance, now I'll hover around cars for a while, it produces about 2 gigabytes of data a second just to keep the car driving. And the slightest little glitch in that, quality of that delivery of that data is crucial to the car's functionality and saving lives, potentially saving lives. Now, all these three factors, producing a lot of data, connectivity, and the time factor, are the three pillars that drives the evolution of digital technology. Now, I have to touch upon the speaker before me when it comes to demographics. And that is, even if you don't think so, we all in this room are a hybrid generation. It's about 3 generations in here, roughly speaking. Sorry if I insulted anybody. We're a hybrid generation because in 10 years, in 2025, everybody that is under the age of 25 will be a digital native. For them, what we think still is fascinating will be standard. Imagine yourself radio. In your parents' generation or their parents' generation, radio was fascinating. For us, it's actually starting to become a nuisance, but radio is everywhere, and we take it for granted. You flip a switch in your car and your home, even in the hotel room, and radio is on. That's the same way that generation, the digital native generation, is going to feel about digitalization. So we're in this shift, and when we're in this shift, we better be careful about the heretics that want to go backwards. And we also need to be careful about the forefront runners who don't want to be super innovative. And I'm saying careful, I'm not saying regulating, I'm just saying careful. There is also another feature to digitalization which makes it, per definition, inclusive. And let me give you an example. The inclusiveness is that if you can apply digitalization, for instance, to healthcare in saving lives, that needs to benefit from the reach that digitalization gives us. So I'm back again to connectivity. Connectivity and reach will actually provide the inclusiveness of the growth of the digital agendas. Now, this is really hard to grasp, but it's a very similar feature to the telephone. I don't know, in my home country, a telephone became a human right more than 40 years ago. Not everybody has a telephone, but it became a right in society. We will see the same type of development with digital features such as distant healthcare or digital healthcare or your electronic doctor or what have you. Now, we all know this world very well. I would say that everybody in this room knows it and lives it. And when I'm asked to put my finger on one single point that will be relevant and important to continue the development and evolution of digitalization, I actually have to put both my feet into the privacy arena. And the reason for that is that the evolution of the technology is fairly much driving itself, and it has been for the last 15, 20 years. The adaptability to us as a society is also driving itself. I'll give you the smartphone and the app in the smartphone. And if you are second guessing me ask yourself when somebody trained you to use an app in a smartphone. And tell me that particular day you went to that training, and I'll be surprised. No, it is self-fueling. And self-fueling things in society are unstoppable. History shows us. Maybe this is different with digitalization, but I doubt it. See, privacy comes into two places. And I'll end my speech with this. The first one is, if regulatory bodies or governments cannot provide privacy and protection for the private individual, we will be at the great loss of the trust of the system. So it is for governments and regulatory bodies to actually guarantee the privacy of the individual, not privacy of the industry. The industry needs to be regulating and providing that regulation for itself. I know this is far-fetched, but it's not the government's job to provide the regulation for the IT industry or even for the usage of the IT industry. Now, technology, we hear technology is going so fast and so slow at the same time. Adaptation of internet connectivity is super fast. Though the different ways we use it is exploding in everything from controlling our home to ordering a taxi, to surfing online, to getting knowledge. You all know this. So I would encourage, as this committee is pushing forward, to not think about the fast, slow scenario, but think about the thinking scenario. You see, technology evolution, when we are in the vortex of going really fast, shows that it requires more thinking than acting fast or acting slow. Now, I am very curious on the next speaker, because without energy, there will be no internet whatsoever. Thank you very much.
So as I said, I was expecting, and it was confirmed, this was an extremely interesting overview about this subject matter, and it looks to me we are at the very beginning, and you know, there's much more to come in regards to what we might expect, what all that means for us in our environment going forward. Now, we are a little bit over time, but we want to still complete the last panelist on energy. And as Jonas mentioned, energy is extremely important. And I can tell you, I'm living in New York City, and I'm experienced 2 power outages over the last 10 years. And one was 48 hours, the other one was 36 hours, which means not only no electricity, no water, no nothing, and I'm living at the 35th floor. And if you don't have an elevator and have to walk up 1 or 2 times a day to get water, if you get water, it's a challenging thing. So energy is extremely important, and we don't think about that along those lines. But besides my simple example, I think what's kind of one of the key things is all those issues around sustainability and energy sustainability, and I'm very curious as well now what Christoph is going to tell us about his work, how he sees what we might expect and what's coming next. And Christoph, please come on stage and share your wisdom with all of us.
Thank you. I'd like just to start by saying that Sandy, the hurricane that you were referring to, that basically brought down New York, is probably one of the issues one could spend hours about, because it triggered a whole set of innovation. We learned a lot from Sandy, and I think we could spend a very exciting moment just going through those learnings. But let me start by simply trying, for those who are skeptical, why should energy be on the agenda? And I hope there's no single person in the room is doing so, but it's not a self-obvious thing. I think 20 years ago, one would have said energy, you know, kind of it's kind of there, and we have it, and it's cheap. And now, what is different today? I give you 3 reasons why all of you should be absolutely concerned about energy. First reason, finances in the room, half of the global capex, roughly, is going into energy, into basically providing us with secure energy. Roughly half, when I say energy, that's oil, gas, electricity, everything. So half of the world's capex is going into energy. Second point, roughly 100 years ago, and I'm not a communist to say that, but roughly 100 years ago, Lenin was probably the first to say development is absolutely dependent on energy. He said communism is Soviet power and electricity for all. Huh? Surprising. It took 100 years for the United Nations General Secretary to say the same thing. Ban Ki-moon did so 3 years ago, and he said, why is energy not a Millennium Development Goal? We need absolutely make sure that energy becomes a SDG, a sustainable development goal, and it's going to be goal number 7 because it's so essential as a fundamental pillar to developing all the other development objectives. So first point, half of the capex. Second point, basic to development. Third point, climate change, obviously. It's going to change everything that we know when it comes to weather, water, food, and obviously energy is critical. About a third of CO2 emissions are out of the energy space. So those 3 reasons, there's a security reason, there is a development reason, and there is an environment reason. We need to balance those 3 when we think about energy. And we call, at the World Energy Council, we call those 3 to balance those 3 actually in terms of priorities. That's not an easy thing. We call it the trilemma, the World Energy Trilemma. And what I'd like to do is tell you why today, and we call today the time of greatest uncertainty in energy. I'm going to quickly mention why, but then tell you what we think should be done about the trilemma. Why is it the biggest time in terms of uncertainty today? We think 20 years back, uncertainty has multiple facets. The first facet of uncertainty is 20 years ago, if you thought about energy as an investor, you thought about exactly one signal, oil price. Today, if you're an investor in energy, you think about oil price and gas prices, CO2 prices, collapsing solar prices. You think about resilience. You think about so many more things that were all a given. So you go from one signal to a multiplicity of signals, and that's complexity, a first aspect of uncertainty. Second, 20 years ago, would you have spoken to anybody who really mattered in the energy industry, and you would have asked, so tell me about speed in energy. What is speed? Help me define speed in energy. You would have had a bit of that and then say, well, I have one thing that is really fast. If you think about transportation, it takes only 20 years to turn around the whole transportation fleet, and the new transportation fleet is actually something that will be really different compared to the old one. Does 20 years sound like speed to you? If yes, we're not from the same world. For me, that doesn't sound like speed. And today, when we're talking about speed in energy, we're talking about, well, let's start with oil prices that were announced to be 200 and the next day were 30. We talk about gas prices that suddenly decouple in Asia. Today is at 17. People dream about $11 per MBTU. We talk about collapsing solar prices from 4.7 to 0.6 per watt peak in only 5 years collapse. We talk about Fukushima, the nuclear outlook changing from one day to the next. Those are all things that happened in some between 5 and 8 years time horizon, and they are dramatical change. So take the 2 together, complexity and speed, that defines uncertainty. And now we have a trilemma, we have massive uncertainty, and we need to find a way how to navigate through uncertainty and still delivering the trilemma. That's what I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to do this with 3 things. First, I'm going to tell you what we measure what energy leaders think. We are in 100 countries. We measure energy leader thinking once a year with an issues monitor. I'm going to show you who keeps energy leaders most awake at night first. I'm going to then show very quickly how we translate some of that thinking into energy scenarios and talk about myths in the energy world. And then 3, what does it mean for policy? And very last, perhaps if you have some time, very few business implications. I know we are pressed with time, but I'm going to cheat a little bit. First, issues monitor Those are roughly 40 issues, and if you're a scenario builder, and I'm not expecting for you to read that, you can all download it on internet, but I'm gonna want you to love this thing by the time you're getting out of the room. You want to download it, you want to use it when you travel to countries and want to know what every country thinks about energy. There's about 1,000 energy leaders from 80 countries who respond to this every year, and they tell us what basically all the drivers in energy. So the macro picture, if you're a scenario builder, we think about the drivers. We have about 40 reflected here, how they are important. We can measure what changes from one year to next, and we can obviously see what are regional differences, etc. I'm going to very quickly run you through the global picture. First, so you see uncertainty, impact, which makes the high uncertainty, high impact area the one that keeps energy leaders most awake at night. And it's very, that's at global level, it's very quick to see that energy price volatility, I spoke about it, that the climate framework uncertainty, that's an obvious one, but also technology issues like electrical storage or the commodity price volatility, again, price volatility. Those are the 4 issues, one could probably say 3 really. Those are the 3 issues that keep energy leaders most awake at night. Sounds probably familiar. What keeps people most busy at work? So low uncertainty, high impact are those issues that basically stay constant and keep us focused during our daily work. Energy efficiency, renewables. Heard about it? Those are the no-brainers. Every single energy company has those somewhere on the agenda, and they are staying there. Those are not bubbles. We have measured up for a long time. We see those not really move as the top issues. Understanding China, India growth, and we have seen all kind of developments there, so that clearly keeps energy leaders awake at night. And then the subsidy issue. The subsidy issue, we're going through transformation on the subsidy side. A lot of countries rethink their approach to subsidies. It's a good thing, but that is an issue that keeps people awake at night. I could talk about CCS here on this map. It's actually flying off the map. And has done so for the past year, carbon capture and sequestration. And if climate change is high, one could ask, why is that? We could talk about that. We could talk about market design challenges at the moment, which is very high up as well. It's going up. I can already tell this year it's going to be higher up than even last year, and already last year it was high up. There's many issues that move very dramatically, but we don't have the time, perhaps in the committee this afternoon, we have to go into great depth. What I'm going to do next is just give you a sense of how we translate some of those trends that we see into scenarios. And we have the last scenarios we have published, we called them Jazz and Symphony. And we have basically said there's 2, if you think about the future, 2050 and the energy, you have to think long term. Even though we say the speedy change, energy assets are there to stay for some time. A hydro dam is probably the longest living thing for 80 years. A hydro dam, you think about 80 years, and even a gas turbine is there for 15 years, which is probably among the solar cell is slightly less. It's probably between 5 and 10 years, but still those time horizons are very long. So actually long-term scenarios do matter if you're an investor in energy, and that's the reason why we are trying to do those. We have said at WEC, and when we do that, by the way, we work with our members in the close to 100 countries, and we try to understand what are the biggest differentiators between different energy futures. And the view has been quite simple. There's a lot of drivers, but the one single most important one driver is the approach that government takes to energy. If you take a relaxed, let it go type of, you put a bit of framework there, but let the market do it, we call that jazz. Or if you take a symphonic approach where you basically say, here's the mix and here's what I want, I choose technology, I choose this and that, that's a symphonic approach. Think of the shale revolution in the US as a jazzy result. Think of the symphonic eradication of energy poverty in China as a symphonic thing. So we are not saying one is good and one is bad. There's clearly good results coming out of jazz and symphony. And I think what we have tried to do is simply describe those two worlds in great depth. And here are some of the results by 2050. First myth, we do not see the clean energy, renewable energy, so all the clean energy taken together, basically outbeat the growth. If we have between now and 2050 a growth of about primary energy growth of roughly 70% in terms of volume, We do not see clean energy alone delivering that growth. Yes, it's a very important part, but fossil fuel is still very strong, and it's still actually between stagnation and slight growth. That's what our scenarios say. It's very different within the different types of fossil fuels. If you look at oil, oil is driven by transport mostly. Transport is, yes, needs going up, efficiency going up as well. Those two roughly even out, and you can think of roughly constant oil, plus minus 15%. That's basically status quo. Gas is going only one way, plus 50 to plus 100 volume percentage between now and 2050, because there's gas can replace, relatively low in CO2, has lots of advantages when it comes to the electricity side, etc. Coal, we go from cheap coal to uncertain coal, plus minus 40%. If you invested in coal, you must love uncertainty. I get the signal, I have only limited time. I know, I promised to cheat a little bit. I go to myth 2. Myth 2 is the climate side. If we have not all delivered, and I could have spoken about renewables, there's great stories to be told of the most dramatic growth rates you find in solar, followed by wind, and there's some others, but solar is the dramatic success story. But still, myth 1 leads to myth 2. We cannot reduce with everything that we see, with current technology, current policy, and current rates of innovation in those two, policy and technology. We do not see the CO2 objectives being met. We need dramatic innovation on policy and on technology side if we want that. Our scenarios, you see that's the IPCC graph, and this is the 2 degrees Celsius world. And those are our scenarios. This is the span of our scenarios. So this is the 2 degrees Celsius world. We are not converging to a 2 degree Celsius world with what we can see with current technology, policy, and rates of innovation. Very briefly, the third myth, energy access, eradication of energy poverty by 2030. We see great progress, and every year there is great progress, but it's not enough. Particularly in Africa, we see today 1.1 billion of energy poor, and by 2050 it's still somewhere between 300 and 500 million, mostly in Africa. And that has to do with lots of issues. It has to be with huge rurality that we see. It's mostly the rural electrification that is the challenge there. But we bring that back, and I'm going to jump over some interpretation, but we bring now the challenges that we have back to policies. How do you act as a policymaker in a time where we have those massive changes, the myth, we don't meet the climate objectives, we have energy access issue, and we need to deliver investments in a time of dramatic change. Leaders hate risk, and change is risk for an investor. So how do we come up with good policy? What we are saying, at all times you need to find an equilibrium between those three, basically energy security, energy equity, and energy and environmental sustainability pillars. We measure countries in around the world, 130 countries, and we rank them. So I'm just giving one example. Germany ranks 11, and they rate BBB, they rank number 11 out of 129. And basically what this tells, such a ranking tells is that you can see on the energy security side, rank 27 today, energy equity 42, environmental sustainability 27. On the equity side, we see deterioration. So what this ranking, for instance, means for Germany, be very careful. The Energiewende is costing money. It's not yet a full issue that hits the policy side, but think of what happened in the UK just recently, basically. The election was driven, to some extent, Miliband wanted to get elected by saying, let's cut tariffs, let's block tariffs, let's freeze tariffs. And that's kind of the thing that obviously shows that in countries like the UK, the affordability side, the equity side, has gone up. Germany may get there as well. And once that happens, it becomes a political issue. It may drive a political agenda. It may drive bringing in a new government. And that's political risk. And that may indeed be very disturbing for a whole economy. I'm leaving it with that, but with key messages in summary. Message one, first, again, you have seen why energy is important in our view. We say it's a development fundamental, it's a CapEx fundamental, it is an environmental fundamental. We go through massive uncertainty. We can only, if we want to attract investment, we can only counter uncertainty with robust policy frameworks. Policy frameworks are robust if we consider the trilemma kind of approach. And for business, some implications are, yes, there is no more cheap coal, it's only uncertain coal. We see that, yes, the digitization is a reality that has also consequences on the cyber fragility side. We see that the decentralization drives new business models. We see the consumer becoming much more an important player, being as an investor or as a prosumer. We see that resilience broadly with energy, water, food, with the cyber side, but also the extreme weather side is more important for energy. And I think all that together, let me not forget the market design is challenged on electricity with implication on gas side. All that together tells a story about a massive transformation in process, and that's probably why this is on your agenda as well. We look forward to further discussions in the committee this afternoon. Thanks.
Yeah, Christoph, thank you very much. I did learn more about energy in the last 10 minutes than ever before in my life, I think, and probably some of you felt the same. So thanks very much again. So as I said, we are a little bit over time now. It's 11:24. So we are cutting the coffee break to, let's say, 20 minutes, and then we are getting back here on stage at 11:45. So we do make a 20 minutes coffee break, and then, as I said, the second part of the panel is going to be a Q&A session. So I would like to invite all of you to think about questions for the audience and to make this an interactive conversation. But for now, I think you deserve the break. So did our panelists, and enjoy your coffee or tea, whatever you drink, and let's get back here in 20 minutes. Thank you.